Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Omar Ben Yedda. I'm the group publisher at African Business Magazine. I'm delighted to be here to host the Africa Risk Capacity COP26 lecture. I'm delighted to have you all here. So, friends of Africa, friends of Africa Risk Capacity, climate change warriors, and it's great to have you today for the discussion on building partnerships for greater resilience and adaptation. So as you all know, we're here in Glasgow. I don't know if many of you have interacted with many Glaswegians, but when we decided to host this event, at our group, we had a quick meeting and we said, okay, so who do we know in Scotland? So we had one of our colleagues did a PhD at Edinburgh. He said, look, I've got exactly the right guy for you. He's Scottish, but really he's an African. So he's married to a Ghanaian lady. He's the honorary consul for Ethiopia here in Glasgow and in Scotland, and he's got a research centre looking at entrepreneurship and innovation in Africa. He also taught one of the former presidents of the African Development Bank, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, and he's dressed for the occasion. So it's my pleasure to welcome Prof. Struffers to say a few words and to welcome us all here in Scotland. Prof, please.
Thank you, Omar. You're a little bit taller than me, I'm afraid, so I'll just put this down there. Yes, well, welcome to Glasgow. First of all, welcome to Scotland. And I don't know if you've seen a man wear a skirt before, but you probably have. And this is our national dress. We have hundreds of different colours, hundreds of different designs, and they're very expensive, actually. But I was walking down here earlier and I saw one of the delegates. She was obviously from the Amazon. She was one of the Brazilian Amazon delegates, and she was wearing all her regalia, including the feathers and so on. And she gave me a really long stare, as if I was somewhat unusual. So I thought I would wear a national dress today because you're here in Glasgow, and it's important that we represent Scottish culture in this event. But as Omar said, yeah, I've got a lot of experience over now several decades working in and on and possibly for Africa in different capacities. My very first job was in the late 1970s at the University of Ilorin, where I helped to set up an economics department, and then I worked in Sierra Leone, and then latterly Kenya and Ethiopia, as Omar has said. So delighted to welcome you to the club here, because I'm a member of this club, and it goes back to 1825, actually. It's got an interesting history. That's all I'll say at this stage. It's not always been in this building, but it's got a history going back. If you go back down to the main entrance, you'll see the portrait of the founder of the club. He looked as if he enjoyed his food. Let me put it that way. If you look carefully at the picture. Just a couple of housekeeping remarks. By the way, we do have toilets, of course, and the gents' hall is just out there, and across from that is the ladies, and there are a couple of others downstairs. Omar said that I run an African centre. I'm a director of the Centre for African Research on Enterprise and Economic Development at the University of the West of Scotland, which is just outside Glasgow in the big town of Paisley. It's just next to the airport, in fact. And we set up that centre actually in this club 7 years ago, and my co-founder is sitting here in the audience, Dr. Adaptation Adewale. I have two deputies, Bisi, and another colleague, I don't know if she's here, Dr. Dina Nziko, who's from Tanzania. And we are a unique centre, we really are, because we focus on 4 areas of research. My own area of research, I'm an economist, professor of economics, and I work on commodities and trade, which is a very important area of research in Africa. We have a strong focus on entrepreneurship, particularly female entrepreneurship. And then we have an interest in logistics and supply chains, and Dr. Adebisi works in that area. And the 4th area is probably an amalgam of microfinance, governance, and so on. And we've brought a few samples of our work here today. Dr. Beasy and I have just published a book on logistics a couple of years ago, and Dr. Dina and I have just published a few months ago a book on enterprise and economic development in Africa. And there are a couple of flyers there. I couldn't bring the full book because they're very expensive, actually, and it's going to be too much. So our centre is unique in that sense that we pride ourselves in that we try and look at Africa from the perspective of a glass half full rather than half empty. I think our African colleagues know what I mean when I say that. And we focus on the future, not the past. We're interested in economic development. And this is something that we take great pride in, and you'll see some of our previous conference proceedings there as well. We have our next conference in January, in fact, and Dr. Beasy is going to be the chair of that conference. So as we often say in Africa, don't we, after a very long speech, with these few words, I'll finish there and extend my welcome again to all of you. I'm looking forward to this seminar and lecture from our distinguished guests, and I hope I get a chance to speak to you later and possibly even a photograph with you if you wish. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Prof. And now I'd like to call Ibrahima Sheikh Jong, who's the Director General of the Africa Risk Capacity, to say a few words and maybe tell us a little bit about partnerships and what we're trying to achieve. Thank you.
Now, Omar, obviously, I did not get the memo about the dress code. If I did, I would have worn actually my Senegalese outfit to at least be able to be as elegant as John is and what he's wearing today. But nevertheless, I take note and make sure next year when we have a lecture series, I come properly dressed. Let me first extend a warm welcome to all of you, not only those who are in the room, but also those watching online. And I was told about 100 people are watching us online, a testimony about the importance of the topic we're discussing today, but also the testimony of the interests of Africans and non-Africans about building a resilient Africa, and that's something we're extremely grateful for. Let me say a few words about our organization and tell you why I'm excited about the lecture we're about to have. If you look at the African continent and look at climate change, for those who've been following up the conversation across the board, we've been making the case that there is a human face to climate change. And that is many Africans that are affected by drought, flood, and tropical cyclone, affecting their life and livelihood. And we believe that should not be lost in the conversation because that is how we can protect the life of many Africans. So therefore, our organization, it's the reflection of the leadership of Africa by creating an institution called the African Risk Capacity, entirely dedicated to making sure the human face of climate change is not lost, and life and livelihood are protected across Africa because of what we do. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but the best way to understand what we do is 3 words: plan, prepare, and response. And the planning side is disasters, particularly related to climate, they don't just happen overnight. And if you plan properly, you can actually take the necessary steps and making sure you can save life and livelihood. Planning is important because if you're poorly organized, by the time disasters strike, you may also lose some life and livelihood, and that's why planning is important. And the response is also equally important, because while you're waiting for the humanitarian agents to come to your help, it may also be late. And that's the reason why by transferring the risk to the insurance market, you are mobilizing resources that allows you to respond rapidly, but also respond in an adequate way so you can save life and livelihood. So we're extremely passionate about what we do because we believe that it affects positively the life of many Africans. Let me tell you why I'm excited about the conversation we're about to have. 4 things very quickly. Starting with the topic, it's not by accident we have resilience and adaptation, because we believe at the African risk capacity, while a lot has been said about investing in adaptation, it's also important that we invest in resilience as well, so we can protect the life and livelihood. So therefore, the topic was designed to reflect the importance of these two aspects of the discussion. And I have no doubt that the people we have on the panel will underscore that importance so that we can walk away at least understanding that connection. The second reason why we are excited to be here, we at the African Risk Capacity believe that not one institution alone can address all the problems related to climate. So therefore, as we understand the problem, it's important we build what we call smart partnership, so that we can join forces and respond to the demand of African countries. And this is something that we strongly believe at the African Risk Capacity. That's our mindset, that's our attitude, that's the way we approach the problem. And I have no doubt the panelists we have around the table bring different sets of solutions so together we can be effective. The third reason why I am excited about this conversation is that in the long run, it is extremely important as we model the risk in Africa, as we tell the stories of the impact that we have, we can demonstrate through evidence that what we do also has an impact in the lives of many Africans. So we at the African Risk Capacity believe in what we call storytelling. And that is to go beyond just the big check that handed over to Minister of Finance and begin to document the stories of communities that we impacted across the board. And last but not least, why I'm excited to be here, I just love to get out of the COP26 center and go somewhere where you can at least not be crowded by so many different people, but don't tell them. But more importantly, I think this place is just extremely friendly and extremely the right place really to have our last event before we leave Glasgow. And quite frankly, I was telling John earlier, I'm extremely delighted to see for my first trip in Glasgow how friendly people are and how helpful they've been since we've been here. So those who are online were not here, you have no idea what you're missing about Glasgow in terms of the people with really and the friendliness, but also the way they've been very helpful. So I look forward to learning from the conversation. I look forward to being inspired and going back to our headquarters and continuing the journey we started in 2012 to continue to serve Africa and protect vulnerable communities so that we can continue to save the life of many, many Africans. So thank you for being here. And again, a warm welcome, and I promise next year I'll dress properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahima. In Tunisia, we wear long robes, so you guys are a little bit more adventurous. In Scotland, a bit shorter above the knee. Anyway, I'd like to call my panelists to join us. Loretta, please, from the UNDRR. You can sit next to me, that'd be great. Dr. Martin, maybe you can sit in the middle. And Eva from Chief Operating Officer at the Africa Risk Capacity, you can join us as well. I'll move this. Excellent. Thank you very much, Ibrahima, for those words. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think if we're all here in terms of COP and in terms of what you're doing, and it's important for us to remember, we're here to help the most vulnerable. I think what we saw in the past year and a half is let's say, the developed world or the West wake up because they felt that because they were vulnerable and they felt threatened by COVID, and so we saw a different type of response. And ultimately, when we're dealing with someone else's vulnerability, we don't always act in the same way as when we're dealing with our own vulnerability. But ultimately, here, what we're trying to do as a community is to deal with the most vulnerable and those who will most need assistance in the future. As we know, 30 of the 40 most vulnerable countries in regards to climate change are in Africa. And ultimately, when we look at the African population, we know that 60% of the population work in agriculture, which delivers 16% of GDP. So climate change is very real for this for these 60% of the people who work in agriculture. We also know that the droughts of 2009, 10, and 11 in Kenya may be accounted for GDP loss of between 7 and 10%. So these are real numbers, and I think in terms of the cyclone Elday in Mozambique, $200 billion worth of damage. Only 77% of that was actually covered by insurance. So there's a lot that needs to be done. In Africa, we've also got a saying: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. So I think this is what this is about. And but ultimately, in terms of complex problems, there isn't a simple, straight solution. It's there are mechanisms that need to be put in place. There needs to be partnerships. Throwing money at something isn't necessarily always a solution. We need to have the execution arms on the ground to be able to deliver the responses that we want. So partners is also about finding the right partners and making sure that we've got the capacity to execute and operationalize all these commitments, the $100 billion here, the $1 trillion there. So first of all, I don't usually do this actually when I'm introducing a panel, but because it's about partnerships and because I don't know, and because I've met so many different people from so many different organizations, I think it would be good to very quickly introduce yourselves and what you do to really understand where you fit in the climate change and disaster risk and building resilience space. So we'll start with you, please.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, and very glad to be here this evening. My name is Loretta Heber-Girardet, and I am the chief of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction's work on risk knowledge, climate change, data monitoring, capacity building, and urban development. It's essentially the technical arm of our office. And what UNDRR is asked to do by the United Nations is to promote disaster risk reduction. And that's what I hope to talk about today. We are very much the custodian of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which is all about resilience. And so I'm very glad to see that it's adaptation and resilience, because I couldn't agree with you more. We need to build resilience if we are going to be able to withstand the impacts of the climate future and other risks as well. So very glad to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Perfect. Dr. Martin?
Thanks. So thanks also for having me. Indeed, a beautiful place. I've been to a couple of nice places in Glasgow. Indeed, the folks are amazing here. We felt very much welcomed. But I think I haven't been to such a nice place as we are in here. So thanks also, Professor Struthers, for having us. So yeah, Martin Kipping is my name. I'm the head of division for climate policy at BMZ. BMZ is the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. BMZ provides basically the lion's share of Germany's international climate finance and climate action, roughly 90%. So a lot on mitigation, but almost a half of the budget source, at least also on adaptation and resilience. So we are also in the lead for a couple of negotiation topics here at COP, adaptation, resilience, LDC related things in particular, but we are also, say, the major German partner for international resilience adaptation action. I hope that's a fair summary.
Yeah, perfect. Eva, please.
Thank you very much, Omar. And thank you very much, Professor John, for your hospitality. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be in Glasgow, as cold as it is. Sorry, I didn't take off my jacket, but inside I'm wearing an African dress. I really am, in my heart. So I'll try not to duplicate too much of what Ibrahima talked about in the beginning. Well, first of all, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for African Risk Capacity Agency, and I'm also the interim head for Policy Technical Services, which really encompasses partnerships and resource mobilization and donor relations. So I'm very glad to be sitting on the panel with two partners in many aspects of what we do today. As Ibrahima mentioned, we are an agency a specialized agency of the African Union. We were established in 2012 with a very lofty mandate to to help African member states to develop innovative instruments, financial instruments to really address the issues caused by disasters that are caused by climate change, natural disasters caused by climate change. So this is a very lofty and ambitious goal for us, and it really hits at the heart of the most vulnerable populations. And we very, very quickly realized we cannot do it alone. So for us, having a discussion on partnerships and building resilience for these most vulnerable is key to our successes and our future growth. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Eva. So good. Look, it's interesting in terms of data. You mentioned data. I mean, I don't know whether Rupert Murdoch is a climate skeptic or not, but what I do know is he's investing in a new weather channel to compete with the other weather channels that currently exist, because there's a lot more climate change. People are interested in the climate, basically. There's a lot more cyclones, floods, etc. in the US. People are interested to see what's happening and how it's going to impact their cities, their countries, their villages. So people have a thirst for data, and I know that data is central ultimately to be able to measure, to be able to make better decisions. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So look, in terms of the responsibilities of the different partners and the stakeholders, I want to understand basically the sort of the value chain. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the value chain in terms of who's doing what, where, and because obviously there's, you talked about the preparedness, there's also the responsiveness, so building resilience, adaptation, etc. So there's actually a sort of a value chain in terms of climate change. Can you tell us a little bit about the value chain and maybe the partners and what you see as effective partnerships?
Sure. And I'd like to come back to your comment about data, because I think it's quite important. Look, one of the most important partnerships that I think needs to be forged, and it's really been brought home to me in this COP26, is greater partnership between those working on climate change and those working on disaster management, disaster risk management. And these are two entities or groups really that have been born out of different processes, the Paris Agreement and also the Sendai Framework Agreement. And I think that if we really want to get ahead of climate risks and to manage better the disaster risks that are emerging from climate, we really need to bring these two communities together. And this is very much at the heart of what UNDRR is trying to promote through more comprehensive disaster and climate risk management. Disasters are growing at a pace that is really outpacing our ability to build resilience. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The number of climate-related disasters has doubled in the last 20 years. 90% of the disasters that are caused by natural hazards are climate-related. And what we know is happening is that most of these climate-related risks are what we call high-frequency, low-intensity. So they're extensive risk. We don't even have the means to measure the impact. Now, the good news is that early warning systems and better preparedness, as was mentioned earlier, is leading to a reduction in the loss of life, which is really important. But climate risks are really leading also to economic losses. And these economic losses, especially in a continent like Africa, are debilitating because they are fueling poverty. And going to your comment about data, I think it's important to follow what's happening with hazards that are being fueled by climate change. And there's a lot of attention and focus on this. But what creates a disaster is that collision between the hazard and the vulnerability and the exposure. And there really isn't enough attention being paid to reducing the vulnerability, the poverty, the inequality that we see in so many countries, the exposure, which is being caused by rapid, unplanned urbanization along coastal areas. So there are multiple dimensions to better understanding climate risk. And if we become too focused just on the hazard, we're losing these really important parts. And so I think that when it comes to reducing climate risk, we need partnerships that span multiple sectors. We need the climate scientists, but we need them to be working with the social scientists, with the agriculture specialists, with the whole host of people in the health sector as well. I mean, we've certainly seen the impact of COVID-19, more than 27 million more people pushed into poverty, which is deepening their vulnerability to climate change. It's really very multifaceted. So UNDRR, the organization that I'm working with, is really trying to bring these different communities together and to say, disaster risk is not the responsibility of the disaster risk management agency. It really is a whole of society approach that's needed. We have seen, far too late, but we have seen governments come together and put in place multi-sectoral approaches to managing COVID, where ministries have put aside their institutional differences, their silos, and they've come together. Why? Because COVID is a systemic risk. It has impacted all of the sectors. We need to start doing the same thing when it comes to climate-related disaster risks and really beef up the capacity of the sectors. But we also need to bring on board the private sector. And there's some interesting work going on in the private sector. And I think that can be scaled up. So perhaps we'll come back to that later. But just to say, we need to break down our institutional silos. We need to understand that risk is everyone's business. And we need to work differently because there's a new normal. So we need to change the way we work.
That's fantastic. Look, you've mentioned lots of different issues there. We'll get back to private sector for sure. In terms of urbanization on coastal areas, I was reading an article this weekend actually, and there's a place called I think Little Haiti in Miami. But Little Haiti is something like 17 feet higher than most of the coastal areas. And actually, in terms of price rise, Little Haiti has seen the largest price rise in property than any other areas. And obviously, Little Haiti was a mini ghetto, but it's gentrification just because it's higher up than the rest of Miami. So, so you're right. I mean, urbanization needs to be thought through with climate change. I mean, there's lots of things that you mentioned there. Even in terms of days lost, I believe that between 2000 and 2015, we had 23 million days lost because of climate change related events. That's 23 million. That's immense. I mean, I hope I don't have to work 23 million days in my life. But anyway, so. Look, Dr. Martin, maybe we'll go to you. I wanted to understand really how your department chooses partners, disperses grants, disperses finances. And I know that Germany, well, I think it has anyway. Germany's taken a front role in terms of its Africa-related policies over the past few years. And so I just wanted to understand how you went about it, choosing your partners and dispersing these funds that you made available.
Well, thanks, Omar. Well, let me start by emphasizing that indeed comprehensive disaster risk management is exactly also the leitmotif we are trying to implement in our cooperation with African partners and other partners around the world. And indeed, Omar, we are trying to be helpful in that field. We have a major portfolio in adaptation worldwide, but in Africa in particular, that's certainly a strong regional focus. Topic-wise, indeed, resilience and climate risk finance and insurance has been one of our core areas. Well, since a couple of years. It actually started in 2015 at the G7, and at the time Germany held the presidency, and there we initiated the so-called Insure Resilience Initiative, basically a push and commitment by the G7 to support climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. That has grown substantially into a global partnership, the Insure Resilience Global Partnership, which tries indeed to bring together the key actors in that sphere. Climate risk finance and insurance, just to be clear, certainly is not the whole solution to adaptation and resilience. There's much more to be done, but it's an important element that we believe has been underutilized in the past and probably remains underutilized to some degree still. There's a lot of potential to improve resilience, reduce vulnerability through prearranged finance and climate and disaster risks finance and insurance. So that Insure Resilience Global Partnership, which we have the honor to co-chair together with the Marshall Islands. So it's a partnership of equals of G20 and V20 countries. V20, that's the finance ministers track of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, with civil society, academia, international organizations, private sector, importantly, basically bringing knowledge and resources from all of these sides together. Under that partnership, we support a range of different instruments. We have committed all in all since 2015, roughly 800 million euros to climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. So a range of this funding goes into multilateral mechanisms. for instance, with multilateral development banks, the World Bank. Global Risk Financing Facility is the biggest trust fund we contribute to. We contribute to the regional risk pools. So the CCRIF in the Caribbean, PCRIC in the Pacific are well-known examples, and obviously the ARC, the African Risk Capacity, to which we contribute through KfW, our public development bank. Besides that, also a range of projects, programs on the meso and micro level, so directly through KfW with partner governments, be it on agricultural insurance schemes or directly to MSMEs. The SIF, the Sustainable Insurance Facility, has just been launched. When was it? Yesterday. By the V20, right? So a whole set of different instruments trying to build up, a risk layering approach, which lives up and is able to continue living up to the rising challenges of climate change.
So does that mean that you prefer to work with the regional bodies or multilateral development banks as opposed to bilaterally with each country?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say so. I think looking at the overall portfolio, there's certainly a focus on multi-country approaches, be it at the global level, through the World Bank, for instance, or through regional risk pools. But in the end, for instance, the World Bank then goes to the country level and adds, for instance, an insurance component, a climate risk insurance component to a national social protection scheme, for instance. So it really depends. Yeah, we try to support the solutions that fit to the challenge, basically.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Eva, we'll come to you. Maybe you need to bring the mic a little bit closer to you so that people online can hear you.
Are you saying I'm short?
No, not at all. Not at all. You spoke earlier on about Ibrahima mentioned smart partnerships. You mentioned to me briefly. I didn't want to hear the answer earlier on, so I could hear the answer now. So what do you understand by smart partnership?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we cannot do everything that we need to do alone. And as Loretta said, we want to go far. No, it was Omar who said, we want to go far, and we recognize that we have to go with others. So in terms of smart partnerships, it's really part of our refresh strategy and doing partnerships very differently. Apart from the MOU that sits on the shelf, we want to ensure that the activities that we identify really feed into our strategy and those of the partner that we are engaging with. So there's a mutual benefit to the work that we do. So there are various areas that we look for smart partnerships, or we already have smart partnerships. And Martin has already mentioned our partnership with BMZ or KfW through BMZ. And I think that is a really great example of a partnership from a donor partnership perspective. We don't see KfW as one of our donors. They're our donor partner. So we work hand in hand with them. And KfW, being a great example, has been holistic in their approach in terms of their partnership with ARC, all the way from funding the capacity building arm, providing capital to the insurance arm. They sit on our board, and they're heading the consultative forum of donor partners. So they engage in every step of the way. So we see them really as partners rather than donors. And for them, I know very well that it's not a matter of providing money for us to operate, but it's really, what is the impact at the end of the day? And they've gone a step further in terms of providing premium financing for our member states. And recently, I think it was maybe day before yesterday, not necessarily yesterday, when KfW announced a new premium financing facility that will be run through ARC Limited, which is our insurance arm, of 18 million. So we're extremely grateful, and we continue to work with not only KfW, but our other donors as well, as partners. So that is one of the smart partnerships that we see. We've really evolved from a donor and beneficiary perspective and really moved on to partners and finding solutions to what we're doing. But in terms of ARC itself and in terms of our operations and the kinds of partnerships that we are seeking really is to address areas where we either lack capacity or we are looking to leapfrog from an innovation perspective. So, in terms of technology, our R&D team work with various institutions that would help them to either share knowledge, build capacity, and identify innovative ways for us to actually address the response to disaster risk management and financing. And talking on data, we do have partnerships with both global and African academia to determine that we get the best data possible for the work that we do, because accuracy at the end of the day is paramount. Unfortunately, in some of our member states, we do not have access to the best data. So those partnerships are also equivalently important. And just to give you an idea of the other kinds of partnerships that we believe are smart, and meaning smart, they're mutually beneficial, but they also help us further our efforts and to help us to achieve our goals. We build on their successes, they build on ours, innovations, knowledge, lessons learned, etc. The kinds of partnership we seek are those that will help us build on our advocacy platform to ensure that we get the word across on the work that we do and the benefits of the ARC mechanism, the benefits of having a systematic approach to disaster risk management and financing. And also, of course, from an African perspective, is working with governments to ensure that they have a policy that responds to disaster risk management and response, and they take that responsibility going forward. We also work with humanitarian actors who have worked with us on a program which we call the Replica Program. So where countries have taken out insurance, we do have humanitarian actors that also take out or mirror the insurance policy that's been taken out, and that helps the country increase their coverage, and of course the numbers of peoples that are actually impacted on at the end of the day. So these are kinds of partnerships we're also looking at, and we're trying to expand on the humanitarian actors that are on our portfolio. We work with development banks for obvious reasons, funding, and also working on mutually beneficial initiatives that are more global or across the African region. An example of that is, of course, our relationship with the African Development Bank, where we have a premium financing facility with them that has really helped quite a few of our countries in terms of accessing premium financing. And we look for more of those types of relationships with development banks, not only on the continent, but further afield. I think that gives you an idea of the kinds of partnerships, and really we're looking to leapfrog from an innovation perspective. We're building on success. We are learning from others' lessons learned, and likewise mutually. We're looking for partnerships that will help us expand our reach, our coverage, knowledge share, of course, and of course fundraising.
Excellent, thank you. So, Loretta, I'll get back to you. You mentioned that previously we used to work in or operate in silos. Do you see, have things changed in the past year or so, and from the past 10 days that you've been attending COP?
Well, I wouldn't say that we have solved the problem by any means. I mean, the way that we see countries managing climate change in many countries is that it's sitting in a Ministry of Environment, and disaster risk management is sitting in a National Disaster Management Agency, and you have other ministries dealing with other things. So, I mean, we are certainly seeing a recognition that the climate emergency is beyond what any one ministry or what any one sector can deal with. And so we're starting to see things like in the Philippines, where they have pulled together the ministries under a single ministry. So you have climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and disaster risk reduction joined up together. So no, the institutional silos are still there. But we are, as I've mentioned, through our comprehensive disaster and climate risk management program, with a focus on LDCs and SIDS, really working to ensure that all the national disaster risk management strategies have a foundation in climate information and the climate futures. And you know, surprisingly enough, just a few years ago, many national disaster risk management strategies did not really take into account the climate futures, did not really look at projections around drought or other types of issues. So there is that disconnect. But at the same time, you have national adaptation planning that is not really having a very solid risk assessment foundation either. And I think one of the challenges is that you can't look at climate risks in isolation of other types of disaster risks. And we've seen this with the pandemic, but there are other types of risks as well. And in fact, many of them are risks that we may not even know that we are going to face in the future, that may emanate from artificial intelligence or other types of threats. So we need a comprehensive risk approach for sure. But just to say something more about the partnerships, I think, you know, we are a small organization, very small. We're 120 people worldwide. Everything we do is through partnerships. There's no other way to have an impact. And there is some exciting partnerships that are occurring right now that I think are going to really help break down institutional silos. And one that I'd like to mention is with the Insurance Development Forum, because one of the challenges we see in LDCs and in some of the V20 countries is the lack of capacity to do risk modeling, to really have a good analysis of risk. And here we're working on a global risk modeling alliance. In fact, they're on the lead, but we're trying to support it to make available to V20 countries, to countries that are on the front line, better risk information. And that is a partnership between the insurance sector and UN agencies, as well as Oxford University and others, really coming together and sharing expertise. Our own organization is working with over 200 academics on the Global Risk Assessment Framework, which is all about making available data to countries so that they can do better risk analysis to inform their planning. We have a program called Making Cities Resilient, which is 10 agencies coming together to help local actors, cities, develop resilience strategies that embed risk reduction and climate change. And just 2 weeks ago, we announced the launch of a center of excellence between the World Meteorological Organization, UNDRR, with other UN agencies joining, so that the UN can collectively harness their different capacities on climate change to help countries on the front line. So I think everything that's happening in the climate space right now is about forging partnerships. The scale of the problem is far too large for us to go it alone. And that's where we're seeing innovation emerge as well. Innovative partnerships, bringing up new solutions, new technologies, and spreading it. So I'm excited about that. And I think that, you know, we have to watch this space because there's a lot happening here. So yeah, thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Martin, I'll put this one to you, but others can feel free to answer as well. So I was speaking to a colleague of mine who I won't name him, her, but no, we were talking about the special drawing rights at the IMF. Africa's got 33 billion, the developed world's got 400 plus billion, and how you should allocate those. Maybe you should allocate them, to channel them through the African Development Bank or others. So I said, oh, what about absorption capacity? Have we got the capacity to absorb? So she went a bit crazy at me, saying, look, you know, that is an excuse that's been used for the past 20 years, but it's just an excuse. Of course, there's absorption capacity. There's financing gap across infrastructure, trade finance, etc., etc. So, but I think I'm not sure whether I'm right or not to have raised it with this person. But I think absorption capacity could be an issue ultimately. And so we're mentioning all these big numbers, Dr. Martin, and you know, we mentioned $100 billion to support climate change related financing. But do you think absorption capacity is a problem, or it's actually getting the money on the table that's the issue?
Well, it's a well-established debate. The one side says or asks, where's the money? The other side asks, where are the good project proposals? So I think there is certainly not an easy answer to these questions, or probably there is some truth of both perspectives. There certainly is, right? We have made good experience by actually providing support, offering cooperation packages, combining both financial support and TA advice. Well, you actually refer to the partnership with KfW, right? Which is not just handing over a check, but a true dialogue and mutual advice. Yeah, partnership, what I would understand as a partnership. So that's normally also the approach we are taking. If, for instance, we support an agricultural resilience program, irrigation program, whatsoever in country X, right? So normally being in dialogue with the government, providing TA and advice where needed, capacity building and infrastructure funding where need is, all right? So I think a major challenge in scaling up adaptation action and probably also adaptation funding, targeted adaptation funding certainly is the analytical basis and the proper planning for adaptation action, right? Loretta referred to a range of initiatives working on data. I could mention some more, for instance, the Wascal and Sascal institutes in Africa who are working on the data and risk analysis side. We have launched a deepened cooperation with PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, which is also pretty cutting edge in that field to partner with African colleagues in developing climate risk analysis and also supporting countries in developing their national adaptation plans. We just recently, I don't recall the day, committed, I think Monday, committed additional funding to the NAP Global Network, which is a partnership that assists countries and supports peer-to-peer learning in developing national adaptation plans, which in the end can provide a proper framework basis for planning respective investments. So maybe let me just stop here. Thanks.
Okay, and Eva, maybe you can tell us a little bit about absorption capacity. Your organization deals a lot with the member states, etc., etc.
Exactly.
So maybe you can share your thoughts on that.
So maybe bringing it down to sort of a very practical perspective. The work that we do cannot be done without proper planning. So we get funding from our donors. It's very clear what our mandate is. It's very clear what the objectives are. And we have a mutual understanding between ourselves and our donor partners. How we achieve it is then, the challenge. For us to be able to move the needle from a DRM and F perspective, good planning. Country engagement is key. How we engage with each country is, of course, different. We have to have a very clear understanding of where their gaps are from a DRM perspective, what they have on the ground, and how we as ARC coming in can actually add value and build on what may already be existing. So it's that level of knowledge, the risk profiling component, and also country strategy papers that really give us a good framework from which to build. And then, of course, it's working with a technical working group, which we develop ourselves from various stakeholders, and then we work with that. We work through them through the life cycle of our program. And at the end of the day, it is key for us to start building a culture. And I think I mentioned this in the beginning, to build that culture, because we will never develop a sustainable pipeline for those funding unless we actually build a culture where the governments, the countries take full responsibility for the response when it comes to disaster risk management and when a disaster strikes. So I think it's within that planning, it's the capacity building that we implement, and it's really working with governments to build policy and change a culture. So and therefore then build that pipeline to ensure that there is that level of absorption.
Perfect, thank you. Loretta, you mentioned that you wanted us to, well, not us in terms of the discussion, but us as the global community to focus more on the upstream interventions as well. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about this and your thinking around that.
Sure. I mean, I come from a humanitarian background, so I'm quite happy to see all of the attention that's being paid here at COP, but in general around anticipatory action, which I think is hugely important, around early warning, early action. But this scale up cannot happen without an equal amount of reflection on the resources that are needed for prevention. And that is still, I think, really under-resourced. And this, if I can just, quote some figures here, if you look between 2010 and 2019, there was $133 billion that was spent in disaster-related funding. So this includes the response and recovery. But only, around $5 billion of this went to disaster prevention. So this is less than 0.5% of overall ODA funding. So the amount of investment that we're actually putting into the risk reduction and prevention measures is still so limited. And yet this is in the face of growing disaster risks. So there is a great push from the humanitarian community to come in earlier with humanitarian responses to reduce the impact. But it's still a humanitarian response. So we are caught in a rather vicious cycle of disaster response recovery, disaster response recovery. And it's going to continue unless we break this cycle and we really put more resources into the prevention angle. And we have a long experience in risk reduction, and we know what works. And we're seeing a uptake in nature-based solutions and other types of interventions that really can ensure that hazards do not become disasters. It's not inevitable, and yet we act as if it is inevitable. And of course, we need to do better preparedness, but we really must not lose sight of the prevention angle. And so that's really why we think it's so critical to better integrate disaster risk reduction with the climate agenda, so we can focus more attention on that prevention angle.
Perfect, thanks. You wanted to say something on that, or
I can just jump in here. I think that resonates very much with us. If I recall correctly, in the flagship report of the Global Commission on Adaptation, I think one type of intervention that had the highest cost benefit ratio was indeed preparedness, right? When it comes to adapting to climate change and increasing resilience. And I think that links up to what Ibrahima said in the beginning. Your approach basically not to only provide rapid financial support in case a disaster strikes, but to indeed link the instrument ex ante with proper preparedness plans, and systems that can actually not only deliver in the case of a disaster, but actually actively make sure that the disaster remains as limited as possible.
Thank you, Loretta. I'm going to go back to you, actually, if you don't mind. You mentioned the private sector. Again, I was looking at some stats from a report in terms of Africa. It represents 2/3 of investments, 75% of economic output, and 90% of employment. So they're influential and they're important. But ultimately, what role do they have in this discussion here?
Well, I think they're critical. I think a lot of the shift towards dealing with the climate-related risks will come from the private sector because, ultimately, who owns the risk? It's obviously the populations, it's the households, but it's the private sector that stands a lot to lose from climate-related disasters and impacts. And so you are starting to see the private sector step up. And I'm not just talking about philanthropy, I'm talking about de-risking their financial decision-making, really taking more into account the implications of the types of investments that they are making. I just give you an example of the infrastructure, which we know that the amount of investment that's going into infrastructure worldwide is enormous. And I think one of the figures I hear is that more infrastructure will be built in the next 20 years as compared to the previous 2,000 years. So in other words, there's just a huge push here. If that infrastructure is made resilient, if the private sector invests 3 to 5% more by ensuring that those infrastructure investments are made resilient, the gains that will be made over time are 5 times higher, 4 times higher, whatever the case may be. They're starting to get it. They're starting to realize that. And we're really seeing some movement on this front, that the private sector is starting to step up more. They're starting to understand that they own the risk and that they can also do more to manage the risk. So they're not there yet, obviously. I know countries where I used to be the head of the Asia Pacific office for UNDRR, and trying to push the resilient infrastructure agenda wasn't easy always because people were looking for quick financial gain. But I think the tide is changing, And I think it really comes down to the investment decisions that are being made, ensure that they're risk informed and climate sensitive.
Yeah. So Eva, I see you nodding, so I'll come and pick on you. But no, but
The lesson is I shouldn't nod. Shake my head.
you don't nod, nor do you nod off.
No, I'm not nodding off.
Neither nod.
I'm trying to keep up.
No, but in terms of you mentioned infrastructure, for example, but really, so in terms of just even pricing infrastructure projects, we just start thinking differently about them and having that and putting a risk element within those infrastructure projects and measuring it.
Yeah.
So I mean, are those the sort of interventions that we'll see from the Africa risk capacity possibly in the next few years?
Well, absolutely. But going back to the question of how we're identifying smart partnerships. I mean, the private sector, of course, are key, especially where they are developing innovative solutions that may not, but that they would have normally seen as commercial, but realizing that it actually could be used for good, for the public good. And so we're trying now to establish partnerships with some private sector companies. It's not so simple, but it's I think the benefits are very apparent, because most private sector companies, especially where they're large enough, too large to fail, in this day and age, and with climate change, with the epidemics, and et cetera, they cannot afford to be seen not to be acting. So it is they're understanding it's good business to actually adhere to a corporate social responsibility program that actually deals with realistic issues in this world. So we're capitalizing on that, have identified a few private sector companies that would be really interested in working in terms of disaster risk management financing, helping us develop innovative tools, and partnering with us, because we have also something that they don't necessarily have, and that is, from a country engagement perspective, a real deep understanding of what people need. And we can help them to be much more demand driven in terms of their own efforts.
Excellent. Look, I'm opening it up to the floor for the next few minutes. I don't know whether anyone's got any questions. Yeah, if you have, there's a microphone there actually, so you can ask a question there. That'll be great, so that people online can hear you as well.
Oh. Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Adebisi Adewale. My field is procurement, logistics, and supply chain management. And that includes humanitarian logistics and all the rest, risk and resilience and everything. I want to actually start raising this question from probably a conclusion in my mind. And that conclusion is it capacity? Is it finance? I reckon it should be both. Because capacity in terms of the ability to be independent, both economically, politically, and socially. And finance in terms of the support, targeted, the support that the finance will give in terms of, targeted projects in Africa. So I want to say that at the breakout of coronavirus in year 2020, there were postulations that African streets will be lined by dead people. Yes? They said, oh, Africa will suffer most. But here we are today, the reverse is the case. This is a typical situation where people from outside Africa think for Africa. I'm an African scholar, and we are very many. And it is an opportunity, one of those opportunities where we African scholars actually say it as it is about Africans, rather than, and I'm not saying this to cause any offense, rather than extra African countries speaking for Africa. Now, 54 countries in Africa, 14 of them are still paying colonial tax to France. 80% of their GDP go to French, leaving only 20%, 22% for them to spend on education, on disaster management, on name it. So how can Africa develop? So the climate change, what concerns Africa is even more than the climate change. We African scholars see that, well, it is because it concerns the West more that they're taking it seriously. In Africa, we talk about lack of education, we talk about hunger, we talk about lack of drinkable water, we talk about lack of electricity. When coronavirus broke out, Africans, they said, this is not our problem because this is the problem from the foreign land. It broke out, as we were told, from China. But in some Western countries, they are saying, oh, the most affected people are Africans, blacks, changing the narratives. And when the reality started to come in, those statistics went off the line. So is it time for us to actually go deep to see, to know, to understand African problems? And this is the question. In terms of climate change, is climate change a top priority for, it affects the whole world, it will affect everybody. You know, in America, every year there's yearly fire disaster, every year there's flood, every year there is a tornado killing people, destroying properties. But when you read journals, they talk about African droughts and paint certain pictures. Is it time for us to actually know, to research, to go deeper? What are key African problems and how can we actually help Africa? Not in terms of aid anymore. We want trade in Africa. Partnership in trade. Thank you.
Thank you. You've raised a number of different points. We'll leave Macron and his teams alone for today. Look, I think one point that was that should be raised is the voice of the African voice at COP26. I mean, I haven't been privy to the conversations. Maybe Dr. Martin can tell us a little bit about when you're speaking to your African counterparts. I mean, are you seeing a strong African voice in terms of the climate change discussions, and is an agenda being put forward?
Well, thankfully, very strong African voices at the climate conference this time as before. The next one will be hosted in Africa, as we know. So, and I see also quite strong African leadership in that topic. Well, on the resilience adaptation side, ARC is a good example, right? On the mitigation side, just to share from our cooperation, there is a deepened climate partnership between Rwanda and Germany that was presented last Friday only. All right, there are other countries. Well, on the Congo forest, there were new announcements being made. So I see a lot of traction there, and the recognition also of what opportunities lie in a socially just green transformation. Another example I should mention, South Africa, right, which was announced at the beginning as well. South Africa showing leadership, tabling an ambitious new NDC and engaging in a partnership with a range of other countries to realize the difficult but necessary socially just transition out of coal. Well, we are having similar challenges in Germany, right, where currently negotiations on our new government are taking place, including on the date of the coal phase out. Also a huge challenge in our country. The more it probably also is in South Africa, which also relies, as Germany, still heavily on coal. So I see a lot of action, movement, engagement also on the African side. Last element, which is particularly relevant for our conversation today, in particular on resilience and adaptation, the Africa Adaptation Initiative, right, which was launched already in Paris in 2015, which is a political umbrella program to advance adaptation action in Africa. So we have been when asked, encouraging our African friends to really engage and well, lead on that agenda and trying to be helpful where we can.
Perfect, thank you. That's great. We'll take the gentleman there.
May I just add?
Yeah, of course. Sorry. Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think it's important for us to add, as Martin says, that Africa Risk Capacity, we see ourselves as a voice for Africa. We represent 35 African member states, and we're growing that number. And so when we speak on any podium, we're not speaking for our sake. We represent a whole host of African nations. And the mandate that we've been given has required us to have a deep understanding of the needs of each member state within which we work. So when we speak to the African problems, we are speaking from really a knowledge. So, and for us to be able to achieve our goals, we have, coming back to the topic of the day, we've done it through collaborations, not only with global institutions, but also with African institutions, with African academia. So we need people like you to be contributing to the response from an African perspective. So I really welcome your comments, but it's our responsibility as Africans. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes. So we'll take two questions at a time. So the two gentlemen there, 1, 2, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, go ahead. We'll take two questions. Basically, we've got another 8 minutes before canapes are served, and I'm starving.
Yeah.
I'm teasing you, but go ahead. We've got time.
I should probably introduce myself first. My name is Richard Taylor, and I'm a professor at University College London, and I'm working currently in 7 countries where we're trying to address SDG 2 and 6, basically around food security and access to water. It was said that the private sector are the ones that own the kind of climate risk. And I guess I had just 2 questions. The first question is, when you speak of this private sector, are we referring specifically to smallholder farmers and, let's say, for instance, livestock rearers at a local level? Because my feeling is that those are the people who are feeling and owning the risk rather than perhaps wealthier private sector, but it depends how you define the private sector. Mm-hmm. The second follow-up question to that is, when we think about climate finance, I'm just wondering to what degree we feel that climate finance is reaching the front line. So there's lots of discussion around commitments and spending, governments declaring a certain amount of contributions to that spending. But the big question, I think, maybe, and when you talk about absorption, is who is the ultimate recipient of this, and who is benefiting from this at the end of the day? Is it the people who are at the front line of the climate change impacts, or is it somewhere else?
Thank you. And I'm going to get all 3 of you to answer that. We'll start with the private sector. Sure. Then we'll go to absorption and absorption capacity, and then are the most vulnerable getting it?
So I think that there is a lot to be gained to work with the private sector so that they really, what we call it, de-risk their investment. So in other words, the type of investment decisions that are being made by the private sector, and I'm not here talking about farmers or this or that. I'm talking about the private sector that is fueling much of the economy right now, especially in the Western world, and making decisions on investments in other parts of the world as well. They are often doing this without taking into account the actual risks that they are creating through their investments. And so I think that there is an important role for us to play to work with the private sector so that they better understand the risks and make decisions once that risk is understood. And I gave the example of infrastructure, for example, but there are others as well. Blindly investing in areas without really understanding the impact of those investments on the environment, on the ecosystems, on the creation or how climate change is going to impact that, I think is a really important issue that the private sector is paying more attention to. So of course, in many contexts, it is the small farmer or whatever that is bearing that risk. And there's a huge role for the government to play in helping to ensure that the right measures are being put into place. But at the same time, I think we are seeing the private sector step up a little bit more. And there are different examples of this that are happening, different coalitions that are being formed amongst the private sector in parts of the world. But that investment angle, the de-risking investment, I think is really important and needs to be looked at a bit more.
So, Dr. Martin, regarding the money, the funding.
Well, not really sure what the question is. When it comes to the reporting on climate risk finance, I can only tell from our experience that well, there is a well-established methodology agreed under the OECD on the climate finance attribution of the spending we are committing, and actually we are taking extra care to make sure that nothing which is not convincingly targeting climate, either mitigation and or adaptation issues, is counted as climate finance. So I can only share from our side that we are pretty strict there. When it comes to the disbursement, or first of all agreement of what the money is spent for, well, actually we besides the multilateral contributions like to the Green Climate Fund or through ARC, we are having direct government-to-government negotiations where basically the two government sides sit together and agree on a cooperation program, right? And then this is being implemented through different mechanisms. KfW is one of them, GIZ another. So, well, owned and actually requested by the partner governments. So, based on a pretty tough results framework and well on substance targets. Yeah? So I would be pretty optimistic that indeed we are delivering, or the funding is still delivering what we are aiming at. Certainly not all projects are successful, like in the private sector, also in the public sector. There is no 100% success rate, but when we look at the numbers, and indeed we do overall reporting on both mitigation and adaptation, what we can achieve through our funding, I think we are making a real difference here. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. I think in some cases, anyway, we won't go into the details, but there are certain differences in terms of how certain countries or certain projects are accounted for and what it relates to. But anyway, but yes, we'll get better at it, and there is a methodology, as you say, and we're adhering to it in most cases. So in terms of when I speak to ARC, actually, they are. I mean, I generally see ARC and AFDB and a lot of these partners at these global events. To the extent that actually one of my friends teases me, calls me globalist in chief, not editor in chief. But I don't want to be associated with the global elite. But anyway, but I see ARC at these events. But ultimately, when I speak to the ARC team, they always tell me actually, our job is actually to help the most vulnerable. So it's about the people. So they always remind me that, okay, you're seeing me here, but actually our work is about the people. So I think the question was, how do we make sure that it actually reaches the people? So Eva, maybe you can ask that one. You can answer that one.
So from a technical standpoint, I mean, I like the question when you say, are the vulnerable people getting it? But from a technical perspective, we can garner all sorts of evidence, data, work through our monitoring and evaluation department, all the way from the beginning of the project life cycle until there's a payout and monies or the benefits are reached to the beneficiaries. However, I think what is most important is if you're going to ask about whether the vulnerable people are getting it, you need to ask them. So one of our key pillars is storytelling, not being told by ourselves, but being told by the vulnerable populations who are real beneficiaries of the aid that comes to them after a payout. And we've had amazing stories, and we continue to compile them. Because for us, it's greater evidence than any number on a piece of paper. Is when a person says that when I received the food package, I was able to do this, that, and the other. I was able to counter starvation within my own family. I was able to then save my other money, other funds for medical provisions for my kids during the time of the pandemic. I was able to buy oil and then produce food on a daily basis not only for my family, but also to sell and make a small income for myself. I mean, we've got a myriad of stories told by men and women in terms of how they've personally benefited. And I think that's really what we want to know. So we continue to focus on storytelling. For us, it's evidence-based testimonies that are not told by ourselves, not told by our donor partners. No other collaboration is party to this. We're actually going to the source. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look, we've run out of time, so you can interact and ask questions to the panelists whilst we have a drink after this. I'd like you to give a warm round of applause to our fellow panelists who have been fantastic. Thank you very much. I mean, after 11 days of COP, you've still got this energy. It's quite remarkable. So I'd like to call upon Mr. Ibrahima Sheikh Jong to make the final closing remarks. Ibrahima.
I don't know about you, but I'm extremely inspired by the conversation we just heard. And they do deserve another round of applause for a job well done. Obviously, Peter, I'd like to thank you and the entire members of the center for welcoming us. I had no idea that there's a place hidden here in Glasgow that's as friendly as the place we have today. So if it was my wish, probably would just bring the whole cup here in your place. So that we have the very friendly conversation that we had over the past hour and a half. Let me say a few words on some of the takeaways that really inspired me, but I'm sure inspired the rest of our team. Because the purpose of our lecture series at ARC was really to bring the different players around the table and have a constructive conversation. And you'll agree with me, we just had a constructive conversation. Because part of our role is to be a convener of the players so we can have conversation that we can utilize to do our job better and serve Africa. Let me also reassure the gentleman who talked about the African perspective and the African voice. We are part of the African voice. You are part of the African voice. And you are absolutely welcome to make sure you can connect with us, to make sure we take into account your concerns. It's important to understand, the starting point of our mandate is to be demand-driven. So listening to our member state is really the bread and butter of what we do. And if we don't, we're not doing our job. I think second, even though we believe in partnership, we also believe in leadership. And that's the reason why the African Union created us to lead, while open to other partners as well. But I think what's important is what Eva said earlier. The mindset is really shifting. I spent a lot of years in the World Bank Group where at the time we talked about donors, but now we talk about partnership. So that mutual respect and mutual benefit between us, to me, it's a very welcome change of mindset. And I think that's basically what we should be encouraging, to make sure around the table we treat each other as equal and then be able to really address the real problem. I think the other thing that really uplifted me, and I'm sure the rest of the team, if you listen to the different interventions, they're all part of the solutions. The question is, how do we bring it together to make sure that we can fulfill our mandates? I was very much encouraged by what you said about developing comprehensive disaster risk reduction program, because for us at ARC, that's a starting point. Unless you get the broad framework of a country, whatever you do, it's not sustainable, it's not fitting in the overall framework. So therefore, I've spoken to the head of DRR to see how we can leverage that expertise to help our member state to develop that kind of instrument, which allows us basically to be effective and be strategic. I think second part of the solution is the financing. And I think KFW, I always keep saying that you're part of the journey at ARC. And because they believe in the concept from day one. And that's the reason why we are very happy that they really continue to support us. What we haven't said in the beginning is ARC, as described by Eva, is no longer a concept. It's been tested. It works. We have about $720 million worth of coverage, 62 million of payout, and 72 million people have been protected. So we're not long talking about a concept being tested. It works. The question is, how do you scale it up? How do you adapt it to different parts of Africa? So it's not a what side fits so, and that's basically really why the financing is extremely important. I think last but not least, whenever you're involved in this type of work, you are absolutely excited by seeing some good stories that shows that it works, because ultimately the only indicator that matters to us at ARC is saving life and livelihood. And if we're able to actually demonstrate that to our monitoring and evaluation process, that we can go back and say, look, we are encouraged, we are energized, and let's do more so that we can save life and livelihood. I myself, about a few months ago, I had the pleasure of visiting some communities in Senegal that benefited from our payout. And I have to admit, I walked away from that visit extremely inspired by what we do. Let's not get too technical sometimes. Let's bring the human face of what we do. And I think that's really the message I wanted to leave with all of you. We're leaving Glasgow and leaving the cold here and going back to the warm in Africa. And but in our mind and in our heart, we believe that what we do is a mission. It's not just a job. It's something that many countries in Africa expect us to do. And I hope all of you will join us so we can join forces and continue to make Africa more resilient while we're investing in adaptation. So once again, on behalf of the entire Africa Risk Capacity Group, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of our heart for making it here. And I have to admit, Omar, when I was told we are going to have this event offsite, my concern, will we have anybody coming to see this event? And I'm just so happy that you're able to join us. And thank again. And you now belong to the Africa's Capacity family, and we'll get back to you. Thank you very much.